the address be agreed to. And I give the call to the member for McEwen.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Here we are, just 5 months since the election, and Australia is going to a complete standstill. It's a bit of a dim memory now, but many of us still recall the campaign of dirty tricks and lies built on fear instead of aspirations. And clearly, our electorate McEwen, we saw the complete lack of a plan for the future that addresses the needs of our modern communities. Because what we do have here is a government that has no plan for this country. No plan to deal with the rampant economic insecurity. All the while our families working face lower wages, ever-increased costs of living and insecure work future. But instead of addressing these concerns, instead of providing policies that work for everyday Australians, what we see is a government formed in the image of its spin doctor Prime Minister. A Prime Minister who is slowly morphing from an ad man without substance to a tin pot dictator, hell-bent on secrecy and not being honest with the Australian people. A Prime Minister who stands in front of chaos with a plastered-on grin and says, "Nothing to see here, folks. Nothing here to see." That's what we've seen this country reduced to since the election. If recent elections around the world have taught us anything, it's that the economy must work for everyone, not just a select few at the top. Our community is crying out for the growing inequality gap to be reduced. They want to see their pay packets at least match the rise in their daily expenses. Wages are the most stagnant they have been in our nation since the Second World War. Even the RBA, once thought as the financial cop on the beat to contain wage growth in the 70s and 80s, now says that the underlying problem for Australian economy is a lack of income growth. The wage price index grew a minuscule 2.3% last year, which the government actually tried to frame as success after record low growth of 1.7% in 2017. And yet, in the decades and a half leading up to 2013, wage growth was an average of 3.5% a year. That was until Tony Abbott and that well-known friend of the worker came to power. It's no coincidence that the comparatively highest wage growth in this country is in my Labor-led state of Victoria. These are all, to some, just numbers on a spreadsheet until you think about the people that are attached to them. The struggling single mum on Newstart who sometimes has to work for minimum wage at Woolies. The father of three who's behind on a mortgage repayment because he hasn't seen his income increase enough to keep up with everyday spending. The public health nurse who's working harder and harder but taking home comparatively less and less. No wonder the people think that the cards are stacked against them, because under this government, they are. This government is still adhering to the worn-out and disproven economic ideology that tax cuts for the richest people, the most profitable business, will lead to better lives for workers. Well, I've got news for this government, and so does every major economist in the country. After 6 years in power, wages haven't got any better, people are struggling more than ever, and the government has no plans to do anything about it. The Libs and the Nats love to talk about their credentials on jobs and growth. You'd be forgiven for thinking that's the only thing they can talk about. And yet, our nation's unemployment rate hides the plain sight there's a booming underemployment in our workforce. Just as an example, to be counted as employed in Australia, you need to only work 1 hour a week. Just 1 hour a week. Between 1 and 26 hours, you are counted as underemployed. It's not good enough that the government does not have a plan for us and our community. They're weak on jobs, weak on growth, but hard on workers. Another pressing issue for our community is the cost of living. Recently, the price of petrol in Victoria has gone through the roof, skyrocketing some 40 cents a litre to $1.74. $1.74 a litre. This sort of price rise impacts on the ever-narrowing household budgets of everyone in the outer north of Melbourne. And add those to the interest rates cuts not being passed on by the big banks, the increasing costs of educating our kids, going to the doctor, or simple things like switching the heater on in winter or a cooler on in summer. And there's a perfect storm of headache for people in our community who are watching jobs disappear daily. People in McEwen make long drives south in the morning for work and then the long drive north in the evening to hopefully make it home in time for dinner. The price of petrol only adds to their frustration with the lack of planning by this government on infrastructure. No major infrastructure spend in the last 6 years throughout the northern part of Melbourne and North Victoria. That is this government's legacy, making us less efficient as a whole while we pay through the nose for the essentials of life. And the previous member spoke about health. Well, this Liberal government has continued to ignore the growing health needs of and the services in my electorate. As with so many electorates on the outskirts of major Australian cities and centres, we have an incredible number of youth and young families in our towns and communities of McEwen. The needs of young people have faced a particular neglect by this government. Over 75% of mental health problems occur before the age of 25. Mental health is an area we cannot afford to neglect as a nation. In our community, young local people identified suicide prevention, support for drug addiction and mental illness as their top 3 priorities. We know that because we went and asked them, what are their priorities? And they did what many young people did. They stepped up, they identified an issue and they lobbied for action. That's why we campaigned strongly for a new headspace in Wallen at the last election. Young people are telling us what they need and we should be listening. That's also why at the last 2 elections I've campaigned for the community of Sunbury to receive a dedicated children's health service in Sunbury, as local services are failing to keep up with the needs of this fast-growing urban area. A facility like this would fill the missing gaps and help take the pressure off our local families. When your child is sick, the last thing anyone wants to be doing is travelling great distances just to get basic health services. You would think that there could be no room for disagreement on such crucial needs in growing communities. You could assume that this would be a great example of where bipartisanship could happen, with commitments from both sides of politics, guaranteeing confidence and security for these towns and our neighbourhoods. Well, you'd be wrong. Not only was there not a single dollar committed to any of these projects, but there was none committed to McEwen at all, full stop. Perhaps even more galling, even more of a thumb nose to the north of Victoria, was the too little too late strategy of the Liberal candidate, who once there was zero obligation, zero responsibility and zero win for him, came out and endorsed the projects that we put forward. If that doesn't take the cake, I don't know what does. We think about infrastructure. The worst offender, the most egregious example of this government's thinking is when it comes to our infrastructure needs. Like much of the rest of the government's platform, their infrastructure policy is threadbare and is absolutely pork barrel political. What else can explain why the state of Victoria, which contains 25% of our population, receives less than 8% of federal funding for infrastructure under the Abbott, Turnbull failed governments and now this one? Areas of regional Victoria, especially like those of our electorate, are bursting at the seams with an influx of residents escaping the unaffordable city house prices. But instead of being met with infrastructure ready for the future, they are met with congested roads and paltry federal investment in public transport. Victoria has and continues to get a dud deal from this failed Liberal national government. It's particularly urgent for projects such as the Diamond Interchange at the Hume Freeway and Watson Street upgrades and the Northern Highway duplication. Throughout the elections, constituents reported to me this was one of the key gripes they had with local infrastructure. Clearly, when you're getting most daily traffic jams on a freeway, something is wrong. So we campaigned on this issue at the last election and we will continue to do so. In fact, only last week at the Wallen Market, I launched this petition calling on the federal government and state government to come to the table and fix this problem once and for all. We need to have the interchange on the Hume. The federal government could do that today. They talk about a $100 billion pipeline of investment, but not 1 cent is being spent. We need Watson Street upgraded. We need the Northern Highway duplicated from the Hume Freeway through the Wallen to remove the traffic bank up on the Hume Highway. We know what we need is for the federal government to join the Victorian government to get these things done. Communications is something that is just continually, each and every year, we get another Prime Minister roll through this failing government, an ever-revolving door of ministers of communication. And yet we're still dealing with the inept approach of this government to deliver a reliable and quality national broadband network, or addressing the serious risk to communities like mine during fire and other emergencies through funding the Black Spot program. We shouldn't be surprised that it doesn't make it any less galling, but the government has put more into its own pork barrelling exercises like it did in round 3 of the black spot funding than actually going out and standing by its own criteria for rural and regional, major transport hubs and prone to natural disaster. If we remember, Deputy Speaker, my electorate had been impacted. 90% of the Black Saturday bushfires were in our electorate. Yet this government, 1.5 towers, is all it was prepared to do. While it went down to save the seat for the member for New England and put 28 towers in his electorate. An area that does not meet the government's own criteria, but that's what this government's become. Something that just pork barrels its way through, secret to the Australian people, and continues on its merry way without giving consideration for Australians and their families. As with commitments on road, health and education, I would welcome the government matching Labor's commitment on mobile black spot funding. Across the Macedon Ranges Shire, Mitchell Shire and the city of Whittlesea, we have a number of locations with poor and non-existent mobile communications, including those in Bullingarook, Gisborne, South Camp, High Camp, Mount Macedon and Woodstock. These are known and proven bushfire-affected prone areas. More than most, they require this constant coverage for updates on conditions and essential fire alerts. $2 million is a very, very small investment to pay for coverage that could quite literally save lives. But with the summers getting longer and heat waves getting hotter, the need to act now, if we are to avert a possible crisis, is getting more and more. The government, instead of pork barreling its own seats, should address genuine, serious safety concerns. Of course, this is the same government that promised every single Australian home would be connected to the NBN by the end of 2016. But here we are, 2.5 years past that, and over 1.6 million homes still do not have access to high-speed broadband. So what are they saying to the elderly in the community who are left without phones because of the dodgy NBN? Or the small businesses, those whose story I raised just recently in this place, losing half of an income stream because of inept installation, blame games and obfuscation by a pathetic minister. This and so many other rollout problems is why Labor took such a considered, detailed NBN policy to the election. Solutions like having qualified technicians being made available to address problems at no cost to the household if a premises was identified as having an in-home wiring problem. This plan would have provided the option for technicians to conduct a health check on in-home equipment such as modems, which would bring good benefits to the consumers. Things that would actually make a difference, a practical difference to people's lives in this digital age. And what are they saying about the countless mobile phone black spots in McEwen that mean we don't have access to basic needs and emergency service? Absolute silence. I'm sick of the promises time and time again being delayed and changed, jeopardising small businesses, impacting daily lives of people in our towns and communities. We have communities still unable to access the services they previously relied on because of a promised NBN that they haven't seen and certainly can't use. If we look at Malcolm Turnbull, I think his legacy to this parliament will be two things: chaos and destroying Australia's opportunity to have a proper 21st century, modern, fast, reliable broadband. And of all of this, we sacrificed the plan of full fibre to the premises NBN, which even now the government has known that this is not working. The fibre to the node doesn't work. Now they're going to fibre to curb. Just put your pride away for 2 minutes. Deliver it to the home and do the right thing by Australian people, not yourselves. The NDIS is another very important reform that was established by the Gillard Labor government. Its purpose was to give every Australian living with disability the chance to live a good, proper life. Trial schemes were launched in most states, including the state of Victoria, that were positively received. Then the coalition government came into power, and over the course of 6 years, what started out as teething issues have snowballed into a total mismanagement of the NDIS. Yesterday in Parliament, we seen the minister stand up and say, "Nothing to see here, everything's fine." If it's so fine, why have we got staffing shortages? Why do we have people coming into our offices each and every day crying because they've got to keep telling this story over and over and over again because the people change and they can't get access to basic needs and services? It's done this because the government chose to hoodwink the Australian people with that empty promise, that absolute lie that the budget was back in surplus. They did that at the expense of disabled people's dignity and lives. And they did that at the expense of the mental health of people who have family members with disability. I don't think you can get it any lower than using people with disability as a pawn to try and pump up your budget surplus. I think that's appalling, and I think most people understand that and see that. And as we found out with the budget, the government stood here before the election each and every day. The Treasurer and the failed Prime Minister up there, budget's back in black, back in black. It never has. In fact, if we go back to 2013 and we think about old sloppy Joe Hockey, who stood here in March 2013 and said, we will deliver a surplus in our first year of government and each and every year since. Well, no one thought that anyone could be any worse than Joe Hockey as Treasurer. But then along came the member for Cook, and now we have the member, I don't remember what his seat name is, but the current Treasurer, Mr Frydenberg. None of those three treasurers, Liberal treasurers, like the proud Liberal free marketers, the proud Liberal people, none of those three treasurers have delivered a surplus, not one of them. And we find out after the election that it didn't happen, despite taking all that money away from disabled people. They still couldn't deliver a surplus. And yet we have the Nats having the audacity of saying that, that Senator McKenzie couldn't deliver a party in a pub. What we've seen from this government is absolute failure on delivery, absolute failure on honesty, absolute failure on truth. And they sit here day in, day out and constantly remind us how bad they are with their secrecy, their untruths. I mean, we've seen the Senate estimates turn into a joke. We've seen that turn into a joke because we can't get questions on health answered. We can't get questions on NDIS answered. We can't get questions on security answered. All these things combining together have made Australia worse placed than what it was before the election. The mismanagement is creating bottlenecks in public hospital beds, with people who should be out of hospital straining our public health system now because they can't get the support they need. This is an inefficient use of a government. Stressed out doctors and nurses should be focusing their energy on pressing cases, not worrying about whether someone has support when they need to get home. That's what it is. You should always value society by how you treat your most vulnerable. Clearly, what we have opposite is people that do not have the respect for people who are vulnerable, do not have respect for people who are doing it tough. If you have a go, you'll get a go was the mantra. What we've seen day in, day out from this government is people who are having a go, trying their guts out, are getting stomped on by a government that has no interest in their future. I'm proud to stand up here and fight for the people of McEwen and the services that are so important to them. And I do not take lightly responsibility and the honour that's given me to the opportunity once again to be a strong voice for them in Parliament. This Liberal national failure government keeps looking for ways to cut, but the cost they are willing to pay is to pay off the backs of working communities. It's achieved through slashing of services, through gutting vital agencies just for the appearance of a surplus. What they never ever acknowledge are the true impacts. They refuse to see that these numbers translate into people and the pain that's felt by every single Australian. Labor will not stop putting those people at the centre of everything we do and the values that we have. That was our election promise. It's the bedrock of the values of the Labor Party, and it's something that I and my colleagues stand firmly behind. The government may have hoodwinked Australians into voting for them at the last election through campaigns of lies and smears through people like Clive Palmer. But what Australian people have woken up very quickly after the election is realised this is a showbag government. It's very expensive, it costs you a lot. When you get home, you find it's full of nothing but rubbish and crap. And we will continue to keep fighting to stand up to get the benefits our communities need and to make sure that we look after the people who need our most support. That is what we're here for.